Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. But then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete. But then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. 1 Corinthians 13:12.
Good morning. It is great to see everyone here and welcome everyone who is joining us on our campuses and online as we continue a series that we're calling Revealed. And the idea, or the hopefully what we'll come across, is that the way in which God demonstrates himself to us is in revelation. He only reveals himself. We can only see what is revealed to us. And so this is the idea. Last week we looked at Matthew 13 and this sort of outlined these parables that he told about the kingdom of God as like a woman who puts a little bit of yeast in some dough, and a man who finds a treasure, and this other. And so we've been looking at this. And so today what I want us to do is I want to begin by asking you a question, and that is, have you ever encountered something that undoes something that you had long assumed? Have you ever encountered something, experienced something in such a way that what you thought it was completely eroded or undone? This happened to me a few years ago. Now, I must confess, I'm an 80s music person, like through and through. Like I'm on a playlist right now, I'm listening to Pet Shop Boys. And so when they ask me, like, hey, Mike, pick a song for Sunday we want to close with, I'm like, look, man, I'm listening to Pet Shop Boys, and if you don't want to close with that, you might want to ask someone else. Well, that would pretty be cool to close with the Pet Shop Boys one week. But all my life, I've never liked country music. And I know, like, some of you guys went down on your list, but I never liked country music. And about a few years ago, both of my girls love country music. So I've kind of gotten accustomed to it because I was always outvoted in the car, so it's always country music. So I know a lot of the country music songs. And so a couple years ago, I came home from work on a Thursday and kind of got ambushed by them because there were tickets for sale to see Florida Georgia Line. Yeah, Florida Georgia Line. So I said, I know this is how we roll. Like, I know the song. So like, okay, I'll go. So we go, and so I'm not like a fashionable guy. I have like the same outfit. I wear pants or jeans and a button-up shirt most of where I go, and I always wear t-shirts underneath. And this is important for what I'm about to tell you. So we get there, there's a couple opening acts. I was sitting there going, okay, this is okay, whatever. Well, Florida Georgia Line comes on, and it was like something else. I was like, these dudes believe in what they're doing. Like, I was watching this for like literally like 30 seconds. The next thing I know, I am up, I am in. I have taken off my button-up shirt, and I tore the sleeves off my t-shirt so I could fit in with the Florida Georgia Line. My kids were like, Dad, what are you doing? So I had encountered something that had completely undone what I thought it was going to be about, right? And next thing I know, I'm like all in, Florida Georgia Line. And so a lot of us, this is what we have missed or never experienced in our relationship with God, because we try to approach things with God particularly based on sort of assumptions or based on things we've learned or things that we've inherited. We try to sort of process this with our minds. You can only discover certain things by sort of letting yourself experience them, letting yourself discover something that is in the experience that you're having. And most of us just don't have mechanisms for this. And so what I want to do is I want to walk us through this today as we look at this idea, and I want us to explore what the gospel is, what this idea is. And the gospel begins with a big fancy word that we'll call, that you're familiar with, we're about to celebrate. That is the Incarnation. This is where God became flesh, and he dwelt among us. That's how John records it. That God became flesh and he dwelt among us. This is the incarnation. This is why we celebrate Christmas. Y'all know this, right? There's like 80-something days left till Christmas. Y'all know this? I mean, we got to start decorating real soon. I'm like already dry. I just said that. I was like, thinking about this. I was like, it's about to happen. So it's coming, but the incarnation. And what you have to sort of think about is most of us are so familiar with this. We're so familiar with this story. We're so familiar with things about God. And then what happens is we also have this list of assumptions, things that we have grown up with or long assumed about God that we just project or overlay on what it is that we are seeing. And so we never get to a place where we're willing to sort of tear our sleeves off because we already know that we don't like country music, or we already know this about God, or we already know that, or he's already done this, or whatever we already know. We just sort of overlay. It just becomes more and more and more the same. And the reason is because we haven't learned to posture ourselves, or we don't posture ourselves to seek, to let him reveal himself to you, let him show more and more of himself to you. John talks about this. The Word became flesh and he dwelt among us. And it says that out of the fullness of the Father, we beheld his only begotten Son. And we beheld, we looked, we gazed. And out of his fullness, we see the fullness of grace and of truth. And these are things that aren't just obvious out of the gate. They're things that happen. What I begin to think about and reflect on is the fact that what God did for us is he entered in. He came into the place right where we are. And this is really important for us to understand what it is that he's doing, because what a lot of us have grown up with, or what a lot of us tend to do, is we read the Bible and we try to find a principle that we can apply to our lives. We go, oh, here's the way. If I do this, then this thing will work. And we sort of create this system of things that works together. And if we do this, and this, then this will be the outcome. Here's a promise. Here's a principle. If I do this, this is what's going to happen. And we sort of approach God like this. And we build inadvertently these systems of faith. These systems by which we expect if we do this, then God ought to do that. And this is what we've been talking about, kind of looking at last week. What we see and what I've been trying to learn how to do for the better part of my adult life, and I've done that. I read Proverbs, there's a lot of principles in there, but what I've been trying to do probably since about 2005 or 6 is when I read the Bible, I just ask a question, Lord, I certainly want to know what you want me to do. I certainly want for you to show me what I can do or how I can be this or how you help me with this. But what I want for you is I want for you to show yourself to me. I want to learn more about who you are. And this takes a whole different way through which we begin to read and understand the Bible and understand the Scriptures. And what you begin to notice is that God is revealing himself. There's two questions I usually kind of ask or use when I'm approaching the Scriptures. Number one is, God, who are you? Show me who you are. And number two, how are you? How do you do things? What can I expect? How do you operate within human history? And how do you operate within my life? What is it that you are up to? And so what I've come to learn about this is what he was doing is he was coming to us in order to enter into us. To enter in, that our aim is for us to encounter, to see something about God, for him to reveal to us, not so we can just check off things that confirm what we already believe, but rather to explore and to see and to discover new things about him, for us to encounter him in a way that undoes us. That begins to, and some of us, we need some of that to happen in our lives. I'm going to tell you about my own sort of journey in just a minute. And what I believe is I've been looking, and I've spent a lot of time over the last few years reading the Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament. These are the eyewitness accounts of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I would read them and say, Lord, let me just know a little bit more about you. Let me know a little bit more about who you are. Show yourself to me. And what I've come to sort of see, and it's actually been, it's really feels like it's just beginning in a lot of ways. The things that I'm learning and seeing and experiencing are so fresh and new. And it gives me a sense of sort of renewed hope for what God is doing in and through my life and in and through our church. But I just sat down and made a couple of notes of what I've seen, that his life reveals, the life of Jesus reveals the force of God's love in the world. And it reveals a way of life under the rule of God's gracious love for us. And you start looking for these things. You start seeking these things. Jesus' teaching reveals to us the heart of God. reveals what God cares about. It challenges us to possess our own bodies and our own minds in a way that we can leverage them to offer ourselves for his redemptive purposes at every turn. His parables that we learned last week, they sort of nudge us towards receptive insight. And this is what we need for God to speak to us, for us to be able to gain insight into him and who he is, because what he's ultimately does, he's revealing himself to us. And we know this instinctively in a lot of ways. We talked about this, the idea that revelation is the language of relationship. It's the way in which we get to know someone else. Revelation is the way of relationship. And it happens in time and over time. Revelation only happens in time, over time. And this is how we sort of see time. You have the past, and then you also have the future. And so we sit sort of right here in this space and in this time. And this is all that we have, right? And then what we do is we say, okay, we're going to understand things about this moment based on what has happened, but there's still a whole lot out here that we yet to know. And what happens is our lives are sort of arranged for this point out here, and this is what creates all the tension in most of our lives, is what's going to happen over here? What is my life going to be like over here? This is why some of us are paralyzed in some of our decisions, right? You're coming to college, and you're going, I got to pick a major. And you're not sure if you're going to pick that right major because you don't know how that's going to work out for you over here. And some of you go, I have a relationship, should I get married? But you're not sure how it's going to work out over here. So you're not going to commit to anything until you're sure. And what you think is if you can just get enough information, if you can just figure this out or that out, then perhaps you'll be able to predict with certainty what this is going to be like over here. And everything in our life experience sort of defies this, and we're paralyzed all on the way. We've been given and granted a way for us to see this because what God has done, we work to build these faith systems so we can better predict the future, and God invites us into a relationship through which we walk with him into it. And those are two very different ways to live. One is you're always obsessed about what could go wrong and what might not happen and how this, and those, listen, planning is important, strategy is important, don't get me wrong. But what we have done is we've sort of overlaid this system onto our faith, and it is robbing us of, I think, both the adventure of what it is to live and to walk with him, and also the hope that is absolutely found in a relationship with him, and it is only revealed in time, over time. Think about this. You're here right now. If you are faithful, if you resolve to walk with him, to seek him, to pursue him, how different do you think your life might look at this point? And more importantly, how differently do you think your view of the world might look at this point? Like, what if we were really shaped by his work in us? This is how he works. This is how we have to arrange ourselves. And what Jesus did is he entered into this moment in time. It's really interesting to me. At the Incarnation, Jesus came, and he did not come like any other, like anybody expected. Like, if you're God and you're going to enter into human history, you come with thunder and lightning and big explosions, and you make people aware. You don't come as a little tiny baby in a forgotten city in the Middle East in the first century. You don't do that. This is exactly how God came. What we learn, what is revealed to us in the Incarnation, is that this work that God was doing requires blood and sweat and tears. It's hard. That Jesus got his hands dirty with the work that God was doing to redeem the world. Right? It's interesting when you start to think about this, you sort of get this picture of Jesus and you back up and you read Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It indicates that he said, let there be light, and there was light. And he said, let this happen. Everything that he spoke with the word until it came to creating humanity. And you know what he did? It says that God, and this is just my imagination, he reaches his hands into the mud and he forms the human being. And then out of his nostrils, out of his own being, he breathes into him the breath of life. And what you begin to notice is that the formative work of God always requires him to get his hands dirty. It requires something from him, requires something of him. And we begin to see this when this begins to get revealed to us, and it helps us understand what's required of us as well. The point is this idea, this revelation happens in your real life. It happens in your life, and what is important is for you to develop a posture of consistency and proximity to God and to who he is and to what he's saying. And this is all found, to me, is found in what we're going to talk about this morning is the gospel. Now, a lot of you you have already heard the gospel and you already know the gospel and you're like, this is gonna sound like old hat to you. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. I told y'all last week that one of the books I read when I was a young pastor, I guess I'm still pretty young, but not as young as I used to be. And the pastor, he was writing at the end of his ministry to people who were beginning theirs. And he said, one of the things that I would do, I would recommend every young pastor do, is to preach the gospel to yourself every day. And I'm thinking like, can we not get something deeper than that? Can we not like preach Isaiah every day or preach something with some like girth to it? No, preach the gospel to yourself every day. And so in my mind, again, I'm 30 years old, 29 years old. I'm going, okay, in my mind, I'm supposed to preach that Jesus, died for my sins and he was raised again and now I get to go to heaven when I die. And I got to just tell myself that every day. And then I began to ask some questions. What is the gospel? Like when I say the gospel, when Jesus says the gospel, when the Bible says the gospel, what does it actually mean? And for some of you, you have long since answered that question and haven't even thought about it in who knows how long. And it's these questions that kind of open us up. In fact, one of the verses that I started with was Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. We'll read this together. It's on the screen. Paul writes this. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." And here's what he says. "Because the gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes." The gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Now, what happened in your brain is you just wrote a story depending on your upbringing and your tradition. Because when I said to you, the gospel is the power of God for salvation, you have a picture of salvation. You know what that means to you. And for most of us, it involves what happens to us when we die. And it's just the way we've sort of inherited this view. You have an idea of what it means to believe in the gospel, right? And it probably has some experience at a church where you prayed a prayer, which are, again, none of these are wrong or bad. They're just things that haven't been pressed on in a very long time. They're assumptions that we have made about things. And what I think is we need to encounter Jesus in a fresh way that perhaps some of these things get undone. Not because they're not true, but they get undone so that we begin to see them with a sense of freshness and something that actually moves us to cause us to sort of, take our sleeves off and kind of jump in full bore. This is what's going to be required of us going forward. My own collision was just like, let's keep reading. The gospel brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Verse 17, "For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed." So I'm going to ask you a question, and you're going to answer it based on what we just read. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. What is revealed in the gospel? Yes, see, this is not as hard as you think it is. And you write that down. Oh, the gospel reveals the righteousness of God. How does it do that? A righteousness that is revealed, you can answer out loud, by faith. By faith. From first to last, just as it is written in Habakkuk chapter 2, the righteous shall live by faith. All of us, more than likely, have a picture of this in your head. Now, my collision was a little unnerving. I was the pastor of a church. I've been a youth minister for a long time. I was the pastor of a church. And now, please, I want you to hear me because I'm going to share this with a little bit more internal dialogue than what you would normally hear. So this is what was happening in my brain. I want you to feel the panic that I felt. Because I'm a pastor of a church, so my job is to preach the gospel, right? You know that. It's supposed to help people walk with God, preach the gospel. And so our church, Port City Church, has always been very come as you are. We're 22 years old, so we've been through a lot of different iterations. But in the very beginning, we've never historically done come down invitations like people are accustomed to in churches. And it's not like a conviction. We don't believe it's not biblical. It's none of that. It's just the way we've done our services at the end. It's just always been a little bit more prudent for us to go, hey, if you have questions, we're happy to help. And we've been able to extend and help and connect. And we've had tons of people receive Jesus and tons of people get baptized. All that happens. So we just have never made that the moment in our services. So it wasn't anything other than we just haven't done that. But people would, especially in the early days, were always asking me, Mike, why don't you do an invitation? And I would kind of give them some answer, especially the best you could do at the end of a service. Here's kind of why, yada, yada, yada. And then this one person said to me, I'll never forget this, I was probably 30 or 31 years old. And I was already insecure as a pastor, right? You're already like hanging by a thread most weeks. And she said, well, you know, you could just present the gospel in like 30 seconds. And that way, if someone were to die in a car wreck when they go home, it wouldn't be on your hands. Whoa. Okay. Let me rethink this. Now, here's what happened in my brain. Now, let me be really clear. I know how to present the gospel in 30 seconds. I know do versus done. I know the Romans road. I know Romans 6:23. I know John 3:16. I can diagram it out. I can give a clear gospel presentation in 30 seconds. That was not the problem. The problem was, do I really believe that that's what the gospel is? That it is designed to make sure that if you died on the way home, that you got into heaven. Now, then as a pastor, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm asking questions about the most basic things I'm supposed to already know and have already believed and all this, and I just need to quit. And I thought, I just need to quit. What church needs a pastor like that? And thankfully, God has been, and most of you have been so faithful to kind of walk this journey together over the last 15 years. And like I told y'all, last week, that when I get angsty about things, I'm not going to do angsty alone. I'm going to dump it on y'all. And we're going to be angsty together, because you got to think about these. You got to ask these questions, because it does matter. So I began to ask myself, what is the gospel? What do I believe about the gospel? What do I really believe about it? I began to back up and look and read and say, how did the gospel emerge onto the scene? Just asking basic questions. And listen, here's the thing. If you're a parent or you're parenting kids, or even if you're a kid, there's some things that have to happen. We grow up in a culture, whether you're raised in it or whether you've been in a church or whatever it is, you inherit a system of beliefs and a view of the world. You inherit that. And at some point, you've got to decide that it's not going to just be what you've heard. It's going to actually be what you believe. And that's work. I inherited a beautiful system. I inherited a beautiful faith. But at some point, it couldn't just be what I'd heard. It had to become what I believed. I was making decisions about my life based on what I believed about God, and I needed to get to the root of what that was. What is the gospel? If the gospel is the power of God in my life as I believe, if it is the way in which the righteousness, the right relationship with God, the rightness with God is revealed over time from faith to faith, which implies that it happens over time. Faith is not a system. It is the activity through which we move in time in our lives, based on what we believe in, what we're stepping on, what we're resting on. So this is true. What does it mean to me? So I began to back up, and I recognized that the gospel, and basically when I did some of the research, I actually went back through the gospels. What I decided to do was just to read the gospels and say, Jesus, how did you present your own message? That was what I did. And it took me about 7 or 8 months. I'm a slow learner. And so the gospel, and this is just a couple things to know, the gospel is simply good news. That's literally all it means. The gospel just means good news. That's it. It's the good news. And at the epicenter of the gospel is an event. At the center of this good news is an event. Anybody want to guess what event it is that makes the gospel of Jesus Christ good news? It's Easter. It's the resurrection. It is an event. When historians write about the gospel, it's not a religious philosophy. It's not a system of teachings. It's not a new religion that's getting started. It was fundamentally, this event happened, this person did it, and we are following him. And out of that emerged all the literature that we have in the New Testament, and then that's what they began to use to make sense of everything that was written prior to that. It was the resurrection. So here's the great news for most of you, especially if you're like heady and you like facts. Go research the resurrection. It's mysterious, to be sure. It's hard to believe, to be sure. It is literally historically verified. People look, and there's writings and research that happens that they cannot explain what happened to this man who Rome executed, and then somehow he wasn't in the grave anymore, and then somehow this movement emerged claiming that this leader had risen from the dead. And so you just have to wrestle with that. And then I've wrestled with it. I'm good with it. The second thing you have to do is, what are the implications of that? If Jesus is who he says he is, what are the implications of that? That's what I began to sort of wrestle with, to try to understand. So over the course of about 7, 8 months, maybe a year, I'm not sure how long it was now, but I began to write down and try to come up with Mike's definition of the gospel. What do I mean when I talk about the gospel? And it'll be on the screen. This is what I wrote. The gospel is the good news of Jesus, the Christ. It's his title, Jesus our Lord, Jesus the King, Jesus the one we've been waiting for. It is the good news of Jesus Christ, his birth, his incarnation, right? His teachings or his life, what he did while he was here, his death and his resurrection. And this was the part that I had never really gotten before. I knew all of that, but I never really understood this part. There are two things that Jesus specifically mentions that he came to do. Number one is to save sinners. And number two is to establish his kingdom. The kingdom of God is like, he said, all the time. That was what he talked about more than anything else. To save sinners, what are the implications of that on me? What are the implications on you? And to establish his kingdom. To be honest, when I wrote that down, I really didn't even begin to know what the kingdom of God was. I didn't really understand it. I had ideas. Is it heaven? What is it? So that began this journey where we began to talk about a way of life under the rule of God's love, that the kingdom is here and it's now. And it's been made available to us as we walk and live under his rule and his reign in every single area of our life. It's where heaven touches earth, where his rule, wherever he has unhindered sway is where his kingdom exists. And it is a coming kingdom as well. And we'll talk more about that later. And so anyway, I want to get real heady here for just a minute and then we'll wrap this up. Because I read this paper by a guy named, his name is David Bentley Hart, and it's called No Enduring City. And he writes this, he says, the message of Jesus is described as the apocalyptic annunciation of the kingdom and its sudden invasion of historical and natural time alike. So you're going, huh? Basically what it says is that the gospel just exploded into history. It disrupted everything. And it was the annunciation, it was the pronouncement, not of a religion, but of a kingdom, a rule. Think about this. If you're in first century Jerusalem, you've already made your way, right? You know what lane you're in, you know how things work. You sort of arranged your life to carefully protect your comfort, to protect your family, to make sure nothing is disrupted. And now here comes Jesus going, there's another kingdom, there's a new way that disrupts and threatens everything that you think about the way you interact with the world. Because to choose Jesus is to deny Rome, and that's a big deal. And all of a sudden, everything that you hold on to, every place that you find your comfort, every system that you've depended on sort of gets threatened or jeopardized. And you think about this in our world today. How many of us, and listen, nothing wrong with this, I'm in the same boat. We spend a lot of time and energy and effort to make sure that our lives are well protected, that our comfort is preserved, that no one can threaten us. We don't want any system that threatens our own capacity to be comfortable or to control our own way, right? We don't want that. And anything that threatens that, we're very resistant to. So this is kind of this is what the same kind of thing is happening to us. And while we know that Christianity or the religion of Christianity has been used in the name of God and Jesus have been used to do terrible things in world history, there's also some really beautiful things that have emerged from that. There's some really great things that have been contributed to our world from people who've established this religion. And so here's why this is important, because what David Bentley Hart goes on to say, says this: it has seemed as if the Christian event is of its nature something too refractory to be contained even within its own institutions, the church. You're like, I don't even know what he's talking about. So like, the gospel coming, the incarnation kind of exploding into time isn't contained by the systems that we create to expand it, right? So refractory is a beautiful word because refractory is like what a diamond does. When light hits a diamond, it doesn't absorb it. It explodes out of it. It's what makes it sparkle. You know that, right? That's what it means. So the gospel is this force. It comes into us, and we build containers and boxes, theological boxes, to hold it so we can reach in and pull out whatever mallet we need to whack whatever issue we need to whack. And we put them back as though it's some kind of theological toolbox. And we're surprised when that gets demolished, when it explodes out. That's what happened to me. That's what happened to me. I thought for sure by the time I was 35, I would know everything I need to know, and then I could just play theological whack-a-mole. I could solve every issue with just a verse. And then you meet Jesus, and you realize that's not what he's trying to do at all. And it's too refractory to be contained. We keep reading. Even in its most enduring and necessary historical forms, there is an ungovernable energy within it that strives, something that strives not to crystallize, but rather than disperse itself into the future, to start always anew, more spirit than flesh or letter. This to me is what I'm trying to understand and trying to help us to see. You're good. Thanks, my brother. When you look and try and understand how God does things, more than likely you're going to end up confounded. Because you think that here's what's, you can trace this through. In one moment, God tells Moses to strike the rock, and the next moment he tells him to speak to the rock, and he strikes, he gets in trouble. In one moment, Jesus says this, and another moment says that. And you're trying to figure out, can you just be clear so we can build a system to know what to expect? And he's like, I'm asking you to walk with me by faith. That's how the righteousness of God gets revealed, from faith to faith. This is why this matters to us. If you look at Jesus, one of the things that he did not consider his position as God something he needed to leverage for his own benefit, right? That's a lesson for us. He always, and he teaches about this. He talks about, he modeled this, that he esteems other people as more important than himself. It's very different than us. He esteems servanthood as the pathway to greatness, not platform building and all the other things that we do in our culture. He seems to have another source of joy and of purpose and of peace that isn't just about how exhilarating or how amusing his experiences here on this earth are. Jesus invites us to follow him in his redemptive work. And I want to tell you, you cannot walk with him and not be challenged and not be changed. You can't do it. If you walk with him long enough, he's going to rub against you. He's going to disrupt something in you. That's what it looks like for us to be shaped and to form. You cannot work with him in his redemptive work in this world without getting your heart broken and getting your hands dirty. The thing that I thought, if I could just learn enough issues, get the system down, I could play theological whack-a-mole with every issue, and we could solve all the problems until you start to meet people on the other end of those problems, on the other end of those issues. And you realize that when you talk to people who are struggling with the issues that we are so passionate about and have all the right answers about, that the people who are struggling with those issues, it is more complex, it is more nuanced, it is never as simple as what you thought it was. I heard Andy Stanley say that, he said, problems are always easy to solve from a distance. You ever done this watching football or basketball? You go, man, if I was the head coach, I can't believe he would do that stupid play. Why would he run that play? And we're complaining about the coach on the field. I think Mac Brown, North Carolina, he said yesterday, he said, it's always easy to coach when you ain't actually coaching. Commentary is easy. Commentary is easy. It's easy to grab a passage and talk. It's hard to flesh this out. What is revealed is that the gospel is fundamentally fleshed out. Where is it fleshed out now? It is fleshed out in my life. It is fleshed out in your life. It is fleshed out in our lives together. We have to encounter Jesus in such a way that it undoes us, or we will create a system to protect our own way of life and to protect our own comfort, and we will resist anything that comes against it. This is the natural thing that we do. But here's what I learned. The gospel is system resistant. It will break out of any system that you build for it. And here's what I want you to understand. The gospel explodes into time. It interrupts and it disrupts most everything that we know. He is inviting us to live in this resurrection power. It is the power of God that He has given to us. It is something that we do not yet know, but it is being revealed in time, over time. And it is new but it's not novel. And what I mean is it's fresh. There needs to be a freshness in your experience and in my experience with God. And my question is, how current are you? How current are you? My kids are weird. If you have kids, they're weird. I think mine's here today. Here's what I mean. Not only are they weird, but it's weird. I remember, like, when your kids get to be, especially get to be teenagers, it's hard to remember that they're not 2. You ever treat your high school kid like they're 5? And you're like, I have to remind myself you're not 5. Or they walk in, you're like, oh, like you're like a grown human with like opinions and ideas. And it's hard to get used to because you're starting to see things about them that are being revealed as you live and do life with them, right? It makes sense. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. The level of love that we have for our systems will equal the level of pain that we feel at their demise. What the gospel invites you into is a journey of faith. Faith is not a system by which you believe the right things about the right God, you get the right results. Faith, the way we define this here, is faith is trust that takes a step. It's you see something and you are willing to respond to what you have seen. Something is revealed about God, something you learn about Him, and you step in based on what it is that you believe and trust about Him. I'm going to say this one more time. The degree of love and dependence that we place on our systems will be directly proportionate to our resistance to change and the pain that we feel when those systems are shattered. I think this is what is happening with a lot of us right now. We talked about this last week, and I think this is really interesting. One of the 10 commandments is, thou shalt not create any golden images or make any images of God. And I used to always kind of wonder, okay, yeah, that's for the ancient culture, but it's really interesting. We don't make like idols with gold and stuff, but we build organizational systems designed to contain God, to manufacture the results that God has. And I was thinking about this because every system that we try to build, I think it's refractory, it just bursts out. It just won't be contained by them. The gospel is fleshed out in us, in our lives, in real life, in the real world. And so when I was thinking about this, that the reason is because once you finally build a picture of God, you have seen something more than what you have currently built, and it is no longer sufficient. What if God was that faithful to showing more and more and more of Himself to you? But this is not something we take lightly. This requires something of us, something from us, and sometimes it comes with pain. C.S. Lewis said this. He talks about the fact, he says that my idea of God is not a divine idea. What you think about God is not a divine idea. Who God is divine. Everything else is us looking to Him. And what he actually said is he said that God is the great image shatterer. He takes whatever things that we've built to represent Him, and He sort of continues to break them. And he learned this at one of the darkest moments of his life. He learned this in the depth of his grief. In fact, he wrote a book about it called A Grief Observed. It was about the loss of his wife. He was so disappointed with God that his wife had died, that God had allowed this. And some of you know exactly what this is like, right? You are so disappointed that God allowed something or didn't stop something that He could have stopped, or that something continues that you're just tired of and you're disappointed with Him. And what you've done is you've sort of projected this image of Him that He should have done this. And all of a sudden it collides and that image gets shattered. And what C.S. Lewis writes about is that as that image shattered, another image emerged, layer by layer, with each moment and each struggle and each step of faith. The righteousness, the rightness of God was revealed from faith to faith, from first to last. It was an image that unfolded, a revelation of God that was more faithful and more kind and good than he ever could have imagined. This has been my own experience. Learning to trust God with things that I'd rather avoid because they're going to break my heart. You know, it's really easy. There are a lot of things in our country, a lot of things in the world that you and I have the luxury not to have to care about, right? You know that. We can wall ourselves off and pretend that everything isn't like it really is and just focus on the things that we want to focus on, which typically leads to our own little worlds. And God invites us into something else. And I'm learning. We're going to talk more about this next week, but I'm learning about what this looks like. So I want to leave with 2 questions for you to answer and kind of wrestle with over the week and maybe for the rest of your life. You're welcome. Question number 1 is, in what ways do you need or want for Jesus to reveal himself to you? And it's not rhetorical. A lot of people haven't thought about this in a while. There's nothing wrong with that. So I'm just putting it in your brain and asking you to think about, how would you like for Jesus to reveal himself to you? What would you like to know about him? What would you like to see from him? The way I found this is to simply ask. Lord, let me see. Lord, help me understand. Lord, grant me insight. It takes time and energy and effort. You have to sit and experience something. You don't just cognitively, logically reason about it. You have to worship and you have to feel. And then question number 2 was, what is it or what do you fear about what you might discover? And I want to give you tremendous permission in this question. When I was young, particularly in my late 20s my late teens and early 20s, I always thought that if I gave myself to God, he's going to make me be a missionary or a pastor or something terrible like that. So I withheld. And I remember withholding. I remember those prayers going, God, I really want to know you, but I'm afraid that if I really sell out to you, I'm going to end up doing this and losing this, and this is going to work like this, and I'm going to have to do this. Have you ever done that with him? Right? For some of you, it's not just a career thing. For some of you, it's like something deeper than that. For some of you, it's like an identity thing. It's something deep, and you're going, man, Lord, if you reveal yourself to me in this way, and this has to change or be shaped or be removed, I don't know if I can take it. It's interesting that, being undone at a Florida Georgia Line concert ain't that big of a deal. It was fun, but that's about it. Being undone by Jesus, seeing him in a way that, encountering him in a way that undoes you, is life-giving. It is life-giving. It is what we are actually made for. It's exactly the language that Isaiah used in Isaiah 6 when he encounters the Lord high and exalted. And he says, woe to me, for I am undone. And then we read from this last week, remember? And he goes on, he says, go preach this message. And the end of it is that the tree is chopped down to its roots and there's nothing left but a stump. But in that stump is the seed that everybody's been waiting for. It is the gospel. It is the good news of the life that Jesus has for you. Life in his kingdom, under his rule, no longer a slave to your sin. And last week after the message, we were talking about deconstruction in our country, in our culture, we deconstruct everything. He said, Mike, are you worried about talking about tearing the tree down to the stump that you're going to just add to the deconstruction? So we've kind of spent the last 5 years trying to build a vision for what it looks like to live a way of life under the rule of God's love, right? We've tried to paint a picture of that. And the reason I'm not afraid for the tree to be cut down is because the only way you get to experience that is for this system to finally be broken, for it to finally go away so we can embrace and walk in the new. Now, this isn't easy and it's not instant, but I think we need to realize we cannot enter into his way of life while clinging to the other. So I want to read to you this passage as we prepare to conclude our time. And it's one of the ones that troubled me, made me ask the questions about what do I fear, but at the same time compels me to pursue more and more. The song we're going to sing, it says, all I want, It says, do what only you can do, have your way in me. And these are terrifying, in some ways, kind of prayers. And here's what Paul writes. He says, whatever things were gained to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. That to be able to see Jesus in such a way that it makes every other thing, hard thing, worth it. For whose sake I've lost all things, I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, but rather one that comes through faith in Christ. I want to know Christ. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings. I want to follow him and be changed. I want to follow him and get my hands dirty. And so somehow I'll attain the life that he's made available to me. Father, as we close, we're going to kind of pose an invitation for you to do what only you can do in our lives, for you to have your way in our lives. And this isn't a promise we're making from now on, but it's rather an invitation in this moment. Lord, that you would have your way in us in this moment. Lord, that you would do what only you can do in this moment. Whatever happens 10 moments from now, 1,000 moments, isn't our concern. Just in this moment, would you do that? And Father, that maybe somehow through that we would see you a little bit more fully. That compels us towards another moment. And then another as your righteousness is revealed from faith, from first to last, each step along the way. God, that we would find a surpassing worth of knowing you that makes everything else pale. Father, do that. And I ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Won't you stand together as we close our time?